the South Carolina Law Enforcement Division. They call themselves SLED for short. I thought it was really telling that he talked about investigations, plural, as I mentioned earlier. So it does it seem like the walls are slowly closing in on Alec Murdaugh? I mean, this is just the latest in some charges, and they're saying that he and others have victimized people.
No question, Anjanette. And this is the worst thing that you can do as a civil plaintiff's attorney. You're talking to a former prosecutor who now does civil work. And we saw it with Tom Girardi and we saw it with Michael Avenatti, both of which were in Los Angeles. Stealing from your client, absolute work you can do as an attorney. And now that those allegations are there, obviously, we know Murdaugh is facing, potential murder charges. We know, obviously, him and his entire family, they're in a host of trouble. But now you're talking about stealing from your client. So even if he can somehow escape all this, he's looking at likely losing his law license out there in South Carolina, if not worse.
Yeah, I think that's the least of his problems.
I think Bill Cosby learned his lesson. I don't think he's going to be giving any civil depositions after what happened in Pennsylvania. That was sort of the basis, of course, for the criminal prosecution, which happened after that civil deposition. But, Philip nailed it. So, after the church scandals many years ago, state legislatures, they opened the statute of limitations, both for criminal and civil cases. Well, the criminal was litigated, went all the way to the Supreme Court, and they struck down those openings as a violation of the ex post facto clause of the U.S. Constitution. But the civil remained. So even though this is a 30-year-old case, many states have allowed these older civil claims to come forward. They've revived them or allowed a window for folks to file civil lawsuits. So what's important in these types of cases, obviously, Bill Cosby is notorious for this type of conduct. But if I were representing this particular client, what I would hope for is some sort of contemporaneous report, something a little bit closer to the early 90s where she reported it to a doctor, law enforcement, a friend, a loved one, something. Because the last thing you want is an allegation that this is fabricated 30 years later. It's generally about right. What I look for is approximately 1 hour of deliberations for each day of trial. So, that's right, right in that mix. That's what you're looking for. Anything longer than that, as a prosecutor, start worrying about a hung jury. Philip probably doesn't worry, but we worry. You start worrying about a hung jury or an acquittal. So, especially a case like this. I mean, this is very serious murder trial. I mean, the jury is going to take their time to get it right. But I mean, at the end of the day, I really like the evidence in this case for the prosecution. Some really bad statements by Gooch, the defendant, really inconsistent. I mean, there's no question that he was lying about his whereabouts. And then I really like, even though I think the state didn't do the best job when it came to the forensic evidence, especially the ballistics, I really like what they did with the cell phone evidence. I think that was very powerful. And I think ultimately that's how we got the conviction we did in this case. Anjanette, fascinating case, obviously really tragic. I mean, can't forget about the victims here. But if you're an appellate lawyer, I mean, you have the Justice Department here. Even though Attorney General Garland has issued a moratorium on the death penalty, defending the jury's verdict here and trying to have the First Circuit decision, which overturned the death penalty, set aside. So really interesting stuff here. Obviously, I got to say that I'm partial to Justice Kagan. She was my law professor when I was in school some 20 plus odd years ago. So, I mean,
how interesting.
I expect the Supreme Court to really come down on ideological lines here, 6-3, upholding this decision. Ultimately, really, trial court judges are that gatekeeper. They get to decide what evidence is relevant, what comes in, what comes out. You really don't, if you're a prosecutor, want circuit courts to be second guessing every one of those decisions. So I understand why the Department of Justice is taking the position in this appeal that it is.
Lori Vallow Daybell, at some point she'll probably, maybe not, but maybe she'll claim she was brainwashed, because of Chad. She was so taken in by him. And Serena says, I know casting out is a thing that's in the Bible. So what do you make of her being able to stay true to her beliefs? She's like, no, you guys are wrong. Like, I know what this is. And her not really, buying into everything that Chad Daybell was selling.
Yeah, it's just the psychology of these cults, right? And we're talking about zombies and evil spirits. Philip's talking about ghouls. We're ready for Halloween, but you got to ask yourself, how does someone get wrapped up in all this? And it's just, the world was supposed to end last year. It didn't. But if you're talking about defending this case on the merits, Anjan, I mean, I agree with you. Really, the only possible defense for Lori is to point the finger at Chad. I mean, obviously, her children's bodies were found in his backyard. So there's really no defense here aside from saying, hey, this was Chad. I was scared. I was under his control, whatever reason. We're seeing a lot of this in the Elizabeth Holmes Theranos trial, right? Where, you're a lot of finger pointing between co-defendants. So that's what I expect to happen in this case as well.
Your office isn't right by the airport courthouse like Philip's, but you practice out there as well. So, this is going to be pretty, as Philip said, formulaic. There aren't going to be any big surprises here. It'll be interesting to see if Robert Durst speaks during the sentencing. Do you anticipate that?
I don't anticipate that, and I'm downtown, so I'm by CCB, where I'm sure Philip goes a lot. Most of the felonies are here. Obviously, this was an airport court, but I agree. Judge Wyndham, we know how he manages this courtroom. Kind of everything goes and anything goes. So I expect the victim's family, Susan Berman, to make their statements. The attorneys to do their thing. But ultimately, I mean, we know that Dick DeGuerin, Chip Lewis, and that defense team has been prepping this case for appeal. So even though Durst will likely die in California State Prison, we'll see what happens in New York. But ultimately, I mean, there's so many potential appellate issues, from the jinx to all good things to, the jury, there being no mistrial during the pandemic, this 15-month gap. I mean, there's just tons and tons of appellate issues. So I don't expect Durst to say anything, because you want to preserve all these issues for appeal, and really saying something is not going to change his sentence one bit, because the judge has no discretion. It's going to be life.
According to SLED, he admitted that he tried to arrange this whole thing, this whole shooting himself in the head, or having this Curtis, Eddie Smith guy shoot him in the head, so his son could get life insurance money. So he's admitted that, according to SLED, and his attorneys admit that he admitted that. So doesn't it make your mind kind of go wild, and you wonder, I wonder what was going on if there was life insurance on the wife and the son, and maybe he's not, an innocent victim there. Does your mind kind of go there and wonder that as a former prosecutor?
Of course, no question. I mean, these are financial crimes. Here's someone who's admitted to either attempting to commit insurance fraud or conspiring to commit insurance fraud. Obviously, we have this now a new charge of embezzlement or misappropriating funds. I mean, these are financial crimes, and clearly Alex Murdaugh is after the money. With respect to person of interest or suspect or target, doesn't really mean a whole lot. I mean, I'm going to talk about another Florida case, Brian Laundrie. He is a person of interest, but we know that he's likely going to be charged in Gabby Petito's murder. So it doesn't really matter what law enforcement or prosecution, what terms they use. Ultimately, it's the result and the ultimate indictment or the criminal complaint that is going to control.
Want to reinstate this death penalty when they declared the moratorium, and then they won't even plan, say it gets reinstated or it gets sent back and he's sentenced to death again. They're not even going to carry it out. Why would they do that?
It's more of an issue of preserving these verdicts on appeal. If you're the Justice Department, you want to make sure that when your U.S. Attorney's Office, they prosecute these cases, that appellate courts, which tend to get involved in these types of evidentiary decisions, you want to make sure that that does not happen, that trial courts have the discretion in terms of their gatekeeping role, determining what evidence comes in or out. So this is much more than about this particular case, which is a very important case. Ultimately, I agree with you. I don't think this Attorney General and this President Biden, will carry out the death sentence. But what they want to do is to send a message to the First Circuit, Ninth Circuit, whatever circuit there is, and say, listen, you 3-judge panels or en banc panels, you can't be stepping in. You can't be taking the district judge's role and overturning these decisions on evidentiary grounds.
And I still can't quite wrap my head around this, that you dislike Mennonites. So you go kidnap a woman you don't know, and you drive her for hours, you duct tape her hands, and then you bash her skull in and shoot her in the head. I mean, I still can't wrap my head around that. And, I would think the jury would want to know that. And I know it's not up, the prosecution doesn't have to show that, but what are your thoughts on This whole crime, it just doesn't make any sense to me. It's so awful.
And Jeanette, they rarely do. And this one, I agree with Philip, is incredibly sad. You have these really sort of offensive, hateful text messages. And I don't think Gucci's attorney did a good job for this reason. He didn't not only detail his car, I mean, he wiped his entire phone, deleted the search history, all the pictures. And it's after searching for Kraus on, law enforcement's Facebook page. So, again, I understand what the defense attorney tried to do here, minimize this, but oftentimes these cases come down to likability and credibility. And I don't think anyone liked Gooch in this particular case. And his credibility was shot when he kind of made lie after lie to law enforcement. So too little, too late for the defense in this case.
Insanity defense could work in this case, and B, that he won't get the death penalty in the murder of Lieutenant Clayton.
Anything's possible, Anjanette, but I think it's highly, highly unlikely. And we saw Lloyd addressing the court. And the judge was pretty patient, but if I were her, I would just say save it for the jury. So in this case, I mean, they're trying to go for the home run. I don't see why. He's already serving a life sentence. So kind of pursuing this insanity defense route to maybe get an acquittal by reason of insanity isn't really going to help him because, again, you're already serving that life sentence. What you might want to do in a case like this is, if you want to stay alive, stay out of death row, is to really pursue a mitigation route. Get up there and say, you know what, I did it. What I did was wrong, but this is why I did it. I had no intention of, hurting this woman or killing a police officer. That would probably be the prudent way. But as you can see, this appears to be a criminal defendant and a client, if you're the defense attorney, that really you don't have a lot of control over here.
Yeah, he seems to want to do things his own way, that's for sure. She's undergoing mental health treatment to restore her competency. She's been deemed incompetent to stand trial. But things like that, with her talking about her daughter being dark, I mean, this wasn't something that happened in an instant. It's almost like they're painting this picture that this was something maybe that was in the works for a while, the murder of these children.
Yeah, very sad, and we've covered a lot of sad cases today. But obviously, whenever you're dealing with the death of a child, particularly the death of your own child, doesn't get much worse than that. I mean, here's a mother, Lori, who's supposed to take care of her children. And what does she do? She either killed them or was allegedly involved in their killing. So, but these videos from Arizona law enforcement, they're so fascinating. Both the friend Serena here, but Lori's own video. After her husband is shot by her brother, she's cold. What does she do? I mean, I think she goes to fast food, was it Burger King? She drops one of the children off at school, then goes with the other to Walmart to go shopping. I mean, just the sort of expression, the lack of any emotion whatsoever, really, really eye-opening, and really gives an insight to us, the public, into what type of people Chad and Lori Daybell were. One of them is special needs. I mean, just kind of think about one of the most vulnerable members of our society, a special needs child, killed by his own mother and her boyfriend. I mean, it really, really doesn't get worse than that. And I don't care where the venue is. Doesn't matter if it's another county in Idaho or anywhere in this country. Every single juror, every single prospective juror, every single person has heard about this case. They've been tracking it for years now. So it's not going to help the defense. No way.
Yeah. And I think, too, I remember when they were, Lori was in Hawaii and she was being told by the courts, you need to produce your children. This was like last, January 2020. It was the beginning of, we were moving toward the pandemic, obviously, and it was big news everywhere. So I just don't see. Here's my question. So let's say Lori Vallow Daybell was indeed brainwashed. There's something going on up there that's just not right. She's been deemed incompetent to stand trial. Do you think that it's going to take a long time to restore her competency? And B, does she eventually, if her competency is restored, wise up and wake up and smell the coffee and turn on Chad?
I mean, ultimately, there may be some sort of plea, but if you're a prosecutor, and Jeanette, how could you possibly give a deal or any type of discount in this case?
True.
You just can't do it. I mean, it's so horrific, the crime. This is something that you really need to make sure that these two spend the rest of their life in prison or get the death penalty. I mean, that's how heinous this is. If you believe in the death penalty, this is a death penalty case. Doesn't get much worse than this. So regardless of Lori's temporary lack of competency. I do believe that she will ultimately be found competent, will stand trial, will receive justice. I expect those trials to be severed in any event. They won't be tried together because they're going to be pointing the finger at one another. So it's not going to make a big difference if Chad goes first in terms of the ultimate result here.
Right where you are in LA. So the judge just doesn't really have any discretion here. I mean, it's life without the possibility of parole.
Yeah, no discretion here for Judge Wyndham. He had a lot of discretion in this case, what to let in and what to let out, but none here. This is going to be a formality. Durst is going to spend the rest of his life in prison, probably here in California. We'll see if he survives to head out to New York. I know you're out there, but there's got to be some criticism of New York prosecutors. This is a case that was cold for many years. In my opinion, of the three murders, Susan Berman's was the hardest to prove. You got to give credit to John Lewin. He took a very difficult case and brought it home. Obviously, the easiest case was Morris Black, and we know what this all-star defense team did there. They got Durst acquitted of the most serious charges. But I would argue that Kathy's disappearance and her murder was an easier case to prove. So why New York prosecutors didn't charge him earlier and wait until after this case concluded to finally consider bringing charges, that's a head scratcher. And it kind of reminds me of Harvey Weinstein. On the flip side, there's been a lot of criticism of Los Angeles prosecutors, Jackie Lacey, now George Gascon. They didn't do anything for years. All these victims of Weinstein, and it's the reverse. Finally, New York prosecutors get a conviction, and guess what? They want to extradite an old sick Weinstein here to convict him, prosecute him out here. I understand why they're doing it. There's victims here, but you got to question, why weren't these charges brought earlier, Anjanette?
Yeah, and if that's true that the Westchester County DA is convening this grand jury next week, it really makes little sense because it doesn't appear that anything has really changed in this case, in the Kathy Durst case. And you've been able to prosecute murder cases. We've seen them where there's no body. So nothing really materially that we are aware of has changed other than, John Lewin tried it out in LA and he won. What's interesting though is that in the Westchester case, in the Kathy Durst case, we now have this gentleman, Bill Stevenson, who used to be married to Jill Biden years and years ago, coming forward. He did an interview with News 12. We interviewed the reporter who did the interview, him saying that he had this kind of torrid one-night, affair with Kathy Durst and that Robert Durst walked in on them. And I emailed him yesterday and I said, hey, are you going to be testifying at the grand jury? And he wouldn't answer the question. He said out of the respect for the family. So does something like that change the game here, that you've got this guy coming out of the woodwork and saying this happened and Bob Durst flew into a rage? Does that change the equation with the Westchester case?
I mean, it moves it a little from an evidentiary perspective, but let's be honest, Ninja, this is all political, right? Durst is going to die in prison. He's going to get a mandatory life sentence here. The appeals will take years. He's frail. There was concerns that he wouldn't even survive this trial. So to spend all the time and money, taxpayer money, to fly him out, bus him out, extradite him to New York where he's going to stand trial. Look, we know prosecutors, most of them are either elected or they're appointed by elected officials. So a lot of this is political. Some of it, small portion, is to get some justice for Kathy Durst and her family some 40-odd years later. But, that Jill Biden ex-husband connection is just one of many political components here in a case that really was launched because of an HBO documentary.
Yeah, totally. I mean, would we even be here had, Andrew Jarecki not had the hot mic with him saying, of course I did it, or killed them all, or whatever he said?
Not at all. And would we be talking about conservators if it weren't Britney Spears? I mean, ultimately, members of the public, they do an incredible part in shaping, unfortunately, for better or worse, legal decisions. So this is just one other example that we're seeing in the Durst case.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see what happens in Westchester County next week, because I wouldn't think it would take all that long if you've got your ducks in a row and you're a prosecutor to present this to the grand jury. So Neama Rahmani, former federal prosecutor, thanks as always for joining us and for your insight. And thank you for joining us today. You can watch Bob Durst's sentencing live on our YouTube channel, and we'll have more on it tomorrow. Law